basically saying, why is it that we're here right now? Because of what came before. And what came before that, and so on. It's a deterministic world with all sorts of non-linear, non-additive emergent stuff coming out. Right. It's this myth that if the world is deterministic, nothing can change. This is gibberish.
Of course, makes you very much run against the mainstream. I always think of Jordan Peterson and his advocacy of the sovereign individual, right? So there is this whole kind of, even on the progressive side, there is a very strong insistence on the promotion of sovereign individuality. So that makes you somewhat of a cultural outsider, and that makes it an uphill battle.
Yes, this is incredibly hard, but we have done it over and over and over again in history.
A few days ago, I had the extraordinary opportunity to speak to Robert Sapolsky, the biologist, neurologist, anthropologist from Stanford University, who is one of the major scientists today. And he spoke to me about his new book, Determined. I have the printout here, published by Penguin Press. And we'll post this video as soon as the book will be available. It's a wonderful book that argues very effectively from a scientific perspective against a still very dominant notion of free will and what we could call, with Jordan Peterson, sovereign individuality. The main point of the book is to show that human behavior, including the intentions that inform it, is based on biological and other environmental conditions. But the book actually does much more than presenting this claim. It also outlines how not only biological reality, but reality as a whole, including social and psychological reality, unfolds as emerging complexity. Sapolsky argues both for an understanding of reality based on complexity and against the reigning paradigm of free will. In this way, his work connects very well, if I may say, for instance, with Niklas Luhmann's social systems theory and with arguments defending amorality I presented in other videos on this channel. But let's listen to Robert Sapolsky now.
So thank you so much, Professor Sapolsky, for joining me to talk about your book. It's really, really a great honor. I have to say, though, that I didn't read your book out of free will. It was suggested to me by two close friends, Paul D'Ambrosio, who also is my co-author, and my friend Milos Rancic. So they brought me to your work, and I'm really grateful to them for that. The book has a double meaning. The book title has a double meaning, Determined, as you say. And the first meaning is basically that human behavior is determined. Maybe you can speak about that first, the first meaning of the title.
Sure. There's obviously been just a few thousand years worth of people fighting over the free will issue. And most of what modern biology is offering is there's a lot less free will than most people assume and that we run our societies on. I happen to be way, way in the lunatic fringe, and that I believe that there's no free will whatsoever. And that's the main argument of the book. And much of what I'm doing in there is trying to go through the nuts and bolts of how we wind up with the brains that we have at this moment. And it's the outcome of influences in biology a second ago, a minute ago, an hour ago, a lifetime ago, a century ago, and so on. And that when you really see the pieces of that come together, there's simply no room for the type of free will that people propose, one which, I'm not trying to sound sarcastic here, but one which requires you invoking magic at some point along the way. And what I try to do in the first half of the book is look at all the contemporary philosophical arguments for free will existing. And these are uniformly compatibilist views. Philosophers who say, yes, 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 I admit the world is made out of atoms and cells and stuff like that. I'm not saying it's all made out of like magic stuff, but somehow here's why you can still have free will amid us being biological machines. And where I think every single one of those approaches has a fatal flaw in it when you know enough of the relevant science. The second half of the book, in a sense, is building on the other way of thinking of the word determined, which is like to apply yourself to a difficult task, which is, essentially I've believed since I was 14 years old that there's no free will at all. And I'm totally intellectually at peace with that. It's straightforward, it's simple, all of that. But at the same time, I have absolutely no idea how we're supposed to live if everyone stopped believing in free will, and how we're supposed to function. And the second half of the book is some very pathetic attempts at getting at what things don't you have to worry about if magically everybody stopped believing in free will, where justice would come from, what the differences would be. And at the end, I conclude that, well, even though it's unimaginably difficult to really live as if you don't believe in free will and to have everybody else doing the same, as people believe less and less in free will, as we understand more the scientific bases of where human behavior is coming from, all that's going to happen is the world is going to become a better, more humane place.
Right. If I might go back to the first meaning of the title, your point that human behavior is basically thoroughly determined. And you're using one core metaphor right at the beginning of the book, the turtles all the way down. Can you say a little bit more about that, maybe?
Okay, it's this obviously made-up story about the philosopher William James, but it could be any philosopher, but it's always some prestigious old white male, is giving a lecture about the nature of the universe. And afterward, this old woman comes up and says, "Professor James, you've got it all wrong. The world is actually on the back of a turtle."
Right.
And Professor James is sort of amused and says, "Oh, but madam, where does that turtle stand?" And she says, "On top of another turtle." And he says, "Oh, but madam, where does that turtle stand?" And she says, "No use, Professor James, it's turtles all the way down."
Right, exactly.
And this is the starting point.
Yes.
Basically, the starting point is, if it's ridiculous when trying to figure out what made us who we are, if it's ridiculous to say it's turtles all the way down, it is way more ridiculous to say instead that somewhere down there is a turtle floating in the air.
Right.
And that's what the free will concept is basically dependent upon.
Right.
At some point, there is a uncaused cause that steps out of all of this.
Right. That's the old
chain.
Aristotelian conception that's always in there.
Well, you look at various points where people who think about this stuff professionally believe they have come up with an explanation for where a behavior has come from, because of the elevated levels of this hormone, because of this version of this gene, because of expansion of the neural connections in this part of the brain, some such thing. And what you get to at every one of those points is saying, great, but where did that come from? And where did the thing that came from come from? And it's, this infinite regression of, turtles all the way down, each one having a predecessor, basically saying, why is it that we're here right now? Because of what came before. And what came before that, and so on. And at some point, this gets completely out of control, and we're back to the Big Bang, and that's like, who wants to go anywhere near that? But for my purposes, it's preceding influences back a couple of million years, explaining why we evolved to be the sort of species we are, back a bunch of centuries, explaining what sort of culture we were raised in, back to when we were just our genome, back to when we were in a womb, and so on. So I don't know if we need to go back to the Big Bang, but when you look at the range of things influencing, shaping who we are, And let's make a mechanistic definition of that, shaping the brain that you have at this instant when you will do or not do some particular behavior. All it is what came before.
Right. Now, this what came before, I think you do a good job in the book as well to explain that this what came before is not just a simple, let's say, chain of causes, but you use the notion of emergent complexity to describe, like in a more complex way, how behavior is determined, not just by a simple kind of linear line of causes, one cause causing the next.
Yeah. And, for the last 500 years or so, if you wanted to understand how something complicated worked, the strategy was obvious: break it down into its component parts. And understand how those parts work and add them back together. And there you go. And you have reductive knowledge. And that was a fantastic thing because it got rid of belief that things like disease were caused by demons. It's what our modern worldview is built on. But it turns out very, very frequently, the most interesting stuff out there is not best understood at that reductive level of component parts.
Right.
Because you put enough of those component parts together, and chaoticism means that you're going to get big, complex outcomes that are intrinsically, provably unpredictable.
Right.
Or you put enough of these elements together, and even though each one is totally simple and straightforward, you put enough of them together, and out emerges things like a cell or a person or a society with all sorts of properties that you can't describe on the level of the component parts.
Right.
And this is amazing. This is like a fantastic revolution because it shows you it's a deterministic world, but not in the very straight, constrained version that's centuries old of it's a deterministic world that is entirely understandable at the reductive level. It's a deterministic world with all sorts of non-linear, non-additive emergent stuff coming out. Right. And what all sorts of people do when they look at what chaoticism is about or emergent complexity is it's just an irresistible playground to decide, aha, that's where free will is coming from. And it's not.
Right. I think that's very crucial and very important to point out that your notion of determinacy or being determined specifically is not one that operates with predictability. To the contrary, on the one hand, you think that we are determined, but on the other hand, there is also unpredictability. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the everyday version of that is like someone sits there and says, okay, here's these 3 students. Which one of them is going to have a spectacular intellectual career? Which is going to squander all their gifts? Which is going to wind up somewhere in between? And like, you really can't predict that unless you're starting with very extreme cases. You can't predict stuff like that. You can't predict behavior on that level. You can certainly predict it on statistical levels. If a society has a steep economic downturn and loss of a lot of jobs, more men are going to be physically abusing their wives. That's like a universal of criminology kind of thing. But you can't predict very well individually, at which point people say, aha, the unpredictability is the evidence of free will.
Right.
The much more formal way of getting at that is what chaotic systems are about, are ones that start off very simply, and there is absolutely no way, and it could be mathematically proven, there is no way that you could predict what the outcome of the system is going to be once it begins to get sufficiently complex.
Right.
There's no way to tell if you start at A, what X is going to look like, unless you first see how A causes B and B causes C and so on. You have to do every intermediate step. And chaotic systems, that's what they're like. And thus, there's then this so seductive pull at that point. These are systems that are intrinsically unpredictable.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they're undetermined. And
exactly.
That's where people make that mistake.
Yes. I think that's a key conceptual idea that runs through the whole book. And I want to go back to that in the second half of the conversation. Just to do the main song and dance again, I want to talk a little bit more about the second half of the book. And I think that's obviously directly connected with the idea of indeterminacy, where you very strongly emphasize the notion of change. That is to say, that again, being determined shouldn't be confused with that there is no possibility to change, but rather the contrary. So maybe you can say a little bit about this part as well.
Exactly. I would say like the three building blocks of people freaking out at the notion that there's no free will, the three sort of approachable building blocks, and then the one that's like deeply existential. The first one is this myth that if the world is deterministic, nothing can change. This is gibberish. And when you actually look at the biology of how change occurs, not only does it prove that change occurs, but it shows even more mechanistically how the world works. The second one that immediately comes up is, oh my God, you're just going to have like people running amok because everyone is going to decide they can't be held responsible for anything at all. And you'll have no way of controlling dangerous people. And yeah, you get rid of the criminal justice system in its entirety, which I think is the only intellectual and moral outcome of viewing us as having no free will. That doesn't mean you let dangerous people run around on the streets. You have a car whose brakes don't work and you keep it off the streets, but you don't preach to the car about it has a rotten soul for doing this. So I think that's sort of the second area that has to be unpacked. What are the approaches we could take to subtracting out a sense of responsibility for some of the worst things that people can do and make the world not only a safer place, but a more humane one? And we've been doing that time and time again over centuries. Just keep doing it. I would say the third one where people get caught up with stuff in this determined second sense of the worst definition is most people who say, yeah, the world is made of atoms, but there's free will, draw this completely false dichotomy. We have our attributes, our eye color, how tall we are, whether we're going to have a good memory span for numbers, whether we're going to have an artistic sense, whether we're going to have a strong propensity towards empathy, whether any of that stuff is biological. That's the stuff we're born with. Those are our basic attributes. And here winds up being this disastrous leap into this belief that what isn't biological is, what do you do with those traits? Do you work hard to overcome your lack of natural gifts? Do you squander your talents? Do you show self-discipline? Are you self-indulgent? That's the real stuff that measures who we are as people. And it is this completely irrational belief that like being able to have perfect pitch as a musician, that's made of biology, but practicing a lot to get really good on your instrument, that's made of different stuff. That's made of fairy dust. So those are the three. And when you look at where does self-control come from and why are some of us better at it than others and where do all that, it's made of the same biology stuff, often of a very different quality as all the other features contributing to making us who we are.
On the basis of this, I'd like to do a few terminological clarifications, perhaps. The first one is going back to this kind of determinism that you're arguing in favor of. And as we said earlier, you distinguish between a determinism that is just completely determined, where also the future is determined, that comes along with predictability. And then you'd like to distinguish this from a second kind of determinism where the future remains open, that includes unpredictability. Now, I was wondering if this second kind of determinism, which is the determinism that you are advocating, could also be expressed with the notion of contingency. Because the notion of contingency, on the one hand, also implies being dependent on previous conditions, but it also implies an open future, a number of possibility, let's say a number of options that could all follow from the present state. So wouldn't that make sense to call this specific notion or this specific determinism that you defend a determinism that operates with a notion of contingency?
Absolutely. That's exact context. And what you see is at every point where what you have turned out to be, where there's a juncture where if you go this way, you're going to wind up being one type of person, and you go that way and you wind up being another. And the contingency makes one of those more likely than another. This is chance. This is luck. And you have to say, did you have anything to do with that being the outcome? Just one example of this. And the last thing I want to be doing here is overemphasizing the importance of genes, because they're important, but they're embedded in all this other stuff. Blah, blah, is there's a particular gene. It's got to do with a neurotransmitter in the brain called serotonin. This gene comes in a few different flavors. And what a lot of lab research with lab animals showed is if you have one particular version of this gene, you're more predisposed towards aggression, towards violence.
Right.
Whoa, let's look at that in humans. This is incredibly important. And what you see is these amazing studies following people from birth up until early adulthood and knowing what their genetic makeup is and looking at this. And you ask this question, okay, if you have this bad version of this gene, are you likely to have a history of violence by the time you're 25 years old?
Right.
And the answer is yes, absolutely yes. If and only if you were abused as a child.
Right.
In other words, that's exactly the contingent moment that determines that. There's a contingent moment somewhere in there. If somebody has a particular profile of testosterone in their bloodstream and the way their brain responds to testosterone, where the outcome is someone who is very prone towards violence and has committed a couple of murders. And in a different set of contingencies, this is someone who would be an aggressive son of a bitch in how they play chess.
Exactly. Yes.
Different splits in the road. So absolutely, it's all about contingencies.
Right. And I think it's important to clarify this because I think the contingency notion highlights the unpredictability of the future as well as the multiplicity of causes. And that brings me to a second question, that the turtles all the way down image somehow suggests that it's really like one turtle below another, whereas probably the image that you're actually presenting is much more complex, that we have lots of turtles, and it's not just one line of turtles. It's a very kind of, not even a pyramid, a whole kind of tree of turtles there.
Yeah,
and it really depends basically on the line that the scientist goes, which turtles he or she identifies as being even below or on top of the other, where kind of on which turtle is kind of interest to the scientist. But again, of course, I fully agree with you. Wherever we look and whichever line we take, we always just find more turtles. We never find actually free will. So I would completely agree with you. However, the image again of the turtles all the way down somehow suggests, again, like something like a causal chain. That's why a second terminological qualification or modification I'd like to ask about, if it would make sense to speak, instead of causes, to speak of conditions, and to speak of conditioning instead of causing, specifically in order to avoid the reductionist conceptual framework.
Absolutely. Contingency, context, dependency, modulating the likelihood of different outcomes. Absolutely. And like, you're absolutely right. It can't be one turtle down. In fact, it's an exponentially more complicated branching tree as you go down there. And one of the most interesting things out there for evolutionary biologists, for criminology, et cetera, is the phenomenon of convergence. There's lots of circumstances where you can start in two different places, and you could wind up like plants from two different sides of the planet living in particularly strange, extreme ecosystems wind up looking exactly the same, even though they haven't had a shared relative in like 200 million years or so. Convergence like that is part of the whole story. But just because you can't tell which of the two possible preceding contingencies gave rise to the same thing, that doesn't mean that nothing gave rise to them.
Right.
And it doesn't mean it's a less deterministic world.
I'd like to ask another terminological question. As we said earlier, you're talking about emergent complexity rather than a chain of causes. Your model is not an Aristotelian model, but your model is a model of emergent complexity. Now, I have very little background in biology, but I'm more influenced by the social theory of Niklas Luhmann, who takes from biology the concept of autopoiesis. Now, I was wondering, when you were writing about emergent complexity, I was always reading autopoiesis. So I was wondering if that, number one, if that's correct, or and if so, is that term no longer being used, or?
No, I think all we've got here is like we're living in different disciplines, and it's pretty much the same concept. And in like the mathematically minded biologists, they talk about self-organizing systems.
Right.
Chemists talk about that a lot, especially people talking about the origins of life. You get enough pieces and there's a whole bunch of ways in which things self-organize. Yeah, for my world, it's called self-organizing stuff or emergent systems. And it's totally wonderful stuff because it tells you something about how entire colonies of ants do amazing things, whereas a single ant is pretty useless. It tells you how an entire collection of neurons does amazing things, even if a single one is useless. And what's most amazing is it's some of the same rules by which a bunch of little stupid ants and a bunch of stupid little neurons produce wildly complex adaptive things at the top end. It's the same rules in all of these systems. So it's totally great. But I think all we're doing here is seeing in your social science world, that's the term that's used, autopoiesis.
Right.
I'm fairly sure I have never heard a biologist use the word, but whatever. It's the same concept.
Okay, we stick with emergent complexity. But as you said, and you corrected yourself, you do this also. You did do this also in the book. You say everything is biological, and then you say, no, it's not just biological. It's both biological and the environment. And then by environment, you refer to cultural factors, to social factors, to biological factors, to historical factors, right? That all factor in. And that are also turtles, that are also among the wide range of turtles that are all influencing behavior, that all condition behavior in one way or another. Now, my question is, can we also, would you allow to speak of emergent complexity, not just with regard to biological phenomena, which is what you are mostly studying, but also with regard to social and psychological phenomena? Could we also have a psychology or a sociology that is based on the notion of emergent complexity?
Completely.
Yeah.
Look at people like Jared Diamond with these enormous large views about how empires and city-states and all of that emerge and why they collapse and what are some of the patterns and what does it have to do with ecology, which some people have decided he overstated the role of ecological disaster in driving some empires into extinction. But that's an example of the rules. Cultures become who they are. It's not by chance that, people, here's an example that I love. In China, Southeast China is dominated by rice farming, and that's highly collectivist. I'm sure you know better than me by now, but like the whole village turns out to plant the seeds for somebody's field. And the next day they all go and plant somebody else's field. And 4 months later, they harvest everything in the old days. And all the time they're using an irrigation system that's 1,000 years old, that's being maintained by 50 cooperative villages. And then you go look up in the north, and I understand zero about any of this farming stuff, but apparently you don't grow rice there, you grow wheat, which is a much more solitary picture. And these incredible studies, people from the wheat growing regions have a more individualistic mindset than people from the rice growing. People from the wheat growing regions are more likely to file for a patent for an invention. They're more likely to get divorced. When you put an obstacle in their path, they are more likely to break up the obstacle rather than go around it.
But then again, isn't it a little bit dangerous to make this kind of a monocausal explanation, that you say people are more individualistic because of these specific social circumstances, the way they grow plants? Isn't it the case, if we, as you just said, take emergent complexity as a feature of biological systems as well as of social systems, as well as maybe of psychological systems, that they all condition one another? That just as we can't have a reductionism that ends up with only biology at the bottom, we should also be aware of a reductionism that ends up with only sociology as the bottom. I mean, the model of emergent complexity shouldn't be reduced to one kind of sphere of causes that then becomes causal. I mean, if there is emergent complexity, they all mutually condition one another.
Absolutely. There's no starting point in these circles of influences. And the thing about feedback loops, recursive ones, is that they are both downstream and upstream of whatever it is you're studying, because that's the essence of it. No, absolutely. And, here's an example that's just kind of cool. There was a famous study published a few years ago, very prestigious journal, looking at judges on parole boards. Do they let the person go? Do they send him back to jail? And it turns out a huge predictor is the longer a judge has gone without eating a meal, the more likely they are to have a harsh assessment of the prisoner. For starters, there's been a lot of challenges to this study, some of them statistical, and my take is that the authors have responded adequately to every single one of those charges, and this is totally solid, and other replications have come in since then. Okay, but at least you have this observation. Wow, as judges get more hungry, they get more punitive. And there's all sorts of models built around that having to do with glucose and getting into your brain and how well your brain is working, all of that. So yeah, this is a rule. But then you see a circumstance where the hungrier a judge gets, the more kind and forgiving they are. What's this about? This is, you do the same study in a Muslim country during Ramadan.
Right.
And why are you hungry during Ramadan, during the daylight hours? Because this is a chance of deep spiritual reflection, and your judges there become more forgiving as the day goes by during Ramadan.
Right.
Oh, okay. So, whoa, something having to do with like some nomadic guy in the Mideast in the 7th century is going to explain. Whoa. Yes, exactly. So it's lots and lots of causes, and which in passing is one reason why people have a lot of trouble seeing that there's no free will there. You get somebody whose brain has been destroyed by a car accident. People are pretty good at knowing the person is not in control of their behavior. But when who the person is right now is the outcome of 1,000 different microscopic influences, half of which we can't detect, half of which haven't been discovered yet. That's much harder to see. All of these had converged just as powerfully as a single massive event.
Right. I mean, if we admit that there are these, as you just outlined, they're not just biological conditions, there are also social conditions, and there are also psychological conditions, right? Mm-hmm. So there seems to be, without bringing in free will, which I'm not intending to do, but there are also, and you talk about in your book a lot as well, there are nevertheless also psychological conditions at work. And these might be involved also in the potential for change, in the sense that there's also this component of conditioning, this component of turtles that is tied to mental operations. And I wonder if these mental operations, thoughts, rational thoughts, feelings, and so forth, that the traditional argument is, in the Western tradition at least, that we should draw the bottom line there. And that's how the free will argument is usually built, right? That this is the most important and the most fundamental cause where we at least should get to. But this is, and you argue against it, but just to make this clear, I think on the one hand, you're not trying to replace, which may be a way people may sometimes misunderstand you, this with a thorough biological determinism, because as you just said, there are many other conditions as well at work, and there are mutual feedback mechanisms. But you also, if I understand you correctly, and that's again where maybe the change element comes in, don't want to deny that among the conditioning elements, the mutually conditioning elements, are also intellectual and rational and psychological turtles. They're also there. They belong to the realm of turtles as well.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'm doing here is saying, oh, ultimately it's all biological. Biology is destined to swallow up psychology, and as long as we're at it, political science and poetry and everything. No, biology, when it comes to behavior, biology and psychology are simply two different words to describe how easy is it to access what's going on in there. Sometimes, like, you want to understand why somebody has wound up with a different faith than their parents and of a particular type, reflecting a philosophy that appealed to them. Yeah, you could try to figure out that with neurons and emergent neuronal, but you're going to be much more successful. It's easier to understand from a psychological perspective. And sometimes you're trying to make sense of somebody who is constantly afraid of things that other people do not see as threatening. And in that case, it's simply more convenient, more understandable, more effective therapeutically to instead try to understand the pharmacology of anxiety. But it's the same exact thing in both cases. Absolutely inseparable. And, I just happen to get trained that it's easier for me to frame a lot of this stuff in terms of biology. And sometimes I'm framing it in a very clumsy way, because I'm not trained in realizing this one is actually much better described from the psychological perspective, but it's one and the same.
Right. I mean, the traditional philosophical arguments for free will that you are forcefully arguing against still are somehow rooted in this Western tradition that the mind should somehow be in control, that it is up to the psychological, the soul, basically, to assume control and to be that condition that conditions all the other conditions. Whereas your argument is basically that is impossible because we have emergent complexity where all these different turtles are constantly mutually conditioning and changing one another. So it is completely illusionary to assume that one of these instances can be in control, right? And if I understood you correctly, that's also the major flaw with the traditional free will arguments, that they somehow assume that there is some form of nexus, some form of kind of spot where the spirit, the mind, the soul, free will can somehow take control of the rest of what constitutes human experience or constitutes the person. Is it correct that you try to undermine, from a biological perspective, the existence of such a nexus, such a point where by the mind could exercise control over the biology of a human being? Is that correct?
Yes, and just to really get in some people's faces, if I'm having a discussion with someone who believes in free will, and in order for them to explain where free will comes from, if they use the word soul, I got nothing more to say to them. And at that point, we should talk about what are the good Indian restaurants in the neighborhood or something like that, because that is just a starting point. But what you allude to here is this broader sense of there's no place to squeeze in free will.
Right.
There's one misconception about this whole, when you study neurobiology and endocrinology and child development and genes and culture and all of that, you see there's no free will. The notion is what you're doing there is, you try to explain the world just with neurobiology and say there's no free will. And a skeptic says, what about that? You can't explain that yet. And you say, that's awkward. You're right. We can't. But endocrinology has an answer to that, but they can't explain that. But fortunately, social anthropology says that each of these disciplines has a hole in the argument that's then covered up by one of the other. That's not it in the slightest.
Right.
What it is it's one discipline.
Right.
If you were talking about genetics, you were talking about evolution, how those genes evolved.
Right.
If you're talking about genetics, you were talking about when those genes are active, and you're talking about environment and epigenetic effects on gene regulation. If you were talking about genetics, you were talking about what proteins are in what part of your brain right now this afternoon.
Right.
It's all one discipline. And when you see this arc of these unbroken influences, there isn't a crack anywhere in there to shoehorn in a homunculus who's made of magic stuff that violates all this.
And yet, I mean, you argue for change. And actually, as you write in your book from time to time, you even want to change people's minds. So there is, I think, while there is no nexus, while there is no soul, while there is no control agent, and specifically not a mental control agent, at the same time, like ideas, for instance, thought, also conditions social circumstances, and that in turn can have an effect on biology, as you also explained earlier with several examples. So I think that's important to highlight, right? That at least if I understood you correctly, that your argument doesn't undermine the fact that people also think, and that also ideas have a certain conditioning effect, for instance, on social, on the emergence of social configurations, and vice versa, right? It's just not in a way where kind of one-way control can be exerted.
Absolutely. An example I use in the book, it's getting dated now, but the movie Hotel Rwanda from years ago about that one incredibly heroic man who saved like 1,000 people's lives during the Rwandan genocide. And you watch that movie and you are so inspired, and you are so inspired, perhaps, to decide you want to learn about the Bosnian genocide or the Armenian genocide, or you are so inspired that you find yourself thinking afterward, wow, one person can make a difference in the world. And there was nothing special about this guy before. Maybe I can as well. Or you're so inspired by what you viewed as like a sentimental, emotionally manipulative script that you want to become a movie critic and say, this is a terrible movie because all it does is manipulate your... Why at those junctures? Why those different outcomes? Because you went into that moment with different sorts of brains.
Not free will. You might have, and again, it wasn't even if you decided by your own free will to go to that movie, you couldn't decide what's going to happen by you watching the movie. So it's always an unpredictable effect of that what we expose ourselves to, right? And then you can even say whatever. If someone convinces you about free will, then you believe in free will because you're conditioned by that person who conditioned you to believe in free will, because maybe it's your culture that you are born into, which is a culture that very strongly prioritizes free will. So your very notion of free will, of course, is also determined, is caused, is conditioned by a specific environment that you find yourself in. Now, I think another, maybe my favorite metaphor of the whole book is this here. You write one sentence, page 386. We are not captains of our ships. Our ships never had captains. So this metaphor of the captain, for me, is a metaphor of the self, right? A metaphor of the self that can exert self-control and so forth, right? So that seems to me at the bottom of the argument against free will, which again I agree with. That in order to have free will, basically what's behind the argument of free will is that free will is somehow either constitutes or is based in selfhood. Yes. So isn't the argument against free will basically an argument against the notion of a self?
Absolutely. We have this construct that we call our conscious selves, and all sorts of very smart neurobiologists have been trying to figure out how consciousness works. And about once every 10 years or so, I force myself to read one of their review papers to see how the field is doing. And the field has not made a whole lot of progress. These are constructs, but this is a myth. There is no blueprint. There is no blueprint maker. And this not only refers to perhaps the lack of a homunculus being the blueprint maker in your head, but the lack of an omnipotent blueprint maker making the universe kind of thing. And you can see exactly where I would run with that. You look at ants, and they will do something adaptive and optimal. They'll figure out what the best place is to put a new colony based on what different scouts report. There is no ant that ever has information about more than one place. There's nobody in charge who could sit there and weigh the options and make an executive decision. The optimal answer just emerges. In the exact same way, when you were wiring up your brain, there is no point there where something is deciding if you have had enough neuronal connections made to this part of the brain, and let's have those neurons go left instead of right at this like street crossing and connect to that part of the brain instead. There's no comparator, there's no decision maker, there's no captains. These things simply emerge.
But this, of course, makes you very much run against mainstream both cultural and intellectual presuppositions, especially, of course, in North America, in the United States, which is very much, I always think of Jordan Peterson and his advocacy of the sovereign individual, right? So there is this whole kind of contemporary, still very strong North American insistence on sovereign individuality. And this can be like Peterson from a conservative side, but even on the progressive side, there is a very strong insistence on the promotion of sovereign individuality. So that makes you somewhat of a cultural outsider. Or am I right in that?
Yeah, I sure anticipate that that's going to be exactly the outcome of this book, because like I've been yelling about this to people, as I said, for 50 years, and like it's exactly that same response. Ironically, I actually had a 3-hour podcast a few weeks ago with Jordan Peterson about these issues.
Wow.
And
I didn't know. Yeah.
Whoa, he was fun and interesting to talk to.
Already published?
He's going to post it, I think, around the same week that the book is published next month.
Okay.
Whoa, was that interesting? Whoa, yes. Was he fun to talk to? Whoa, does he have a different view of the world than I do? Yes. But nonetheless, that was great. But he is the epitome of that sense that not only do we have agency, but even if we didn't, you shouldn't tell people that we don't have it, because the best of what we produce is driven by the sense of us being captains of ships, and we're not, and there's no captains.
This brings me to maybe the last thing. I like this. I mean, you're mostly referring to analytic philosophy, but my background is much more German and continental philosophies and Asian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, which has a much, much weaker insistence on the sovereign individual. And one of my favorite authors is Friedrich Nietzsche. And when reading your book, I often thought about this one half-famous sentence from Twilight of the Idols. And he says that we won't get rid of God as long as we believe in grammar. Because he's talking about the influence on the subject-object construction in Western grammar, and that very much language also emphasizes the subject and subjectivity and agency, right? You can just think about the sentence, "It rains." That's something I always like to refer to, right? Even when, with regard to raining, we somehow need grammatically to ascribe an agent, a subject who rains, right? It rains, right? Yes. And so this is, I think, the background of why he says we won't get rid of God as long as we believe in grammar. So maybe we can say we won't get rid of the idea of free will, or we won't get rid of the idea of the sovereign individual as long as we speak English.
Quite possibly. And like all sorts of realms of like anthrolinguistics, look at how you think very differently in different languages. I mean, this is Sapir-Whorf. This is a concept that's been around for like a century now. And people
has been criticized strongly as well.
Plenty, and supported plenty. And like, if you have someone where what they can say is, oh, that other person is right in front of me, that's going to be a very different worldview than in language groups where you would say that person who is just downhill from that tree.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is, I think the uphill battle, on the one hand, you're fighting an uphill battle, let's say, against the culture of the sovereign individual. But I think the hill is even steeper, because you need to use English language. And you need to use words such as determined, and you need to use words such as cause, and so forth. And you need to use a grammar which always suggests agency. And so that's also an impression that I had, that you're also, to an extent, fighting against the language that you inherited and that you have to use to express your ideas. Or am I wrong?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And we say, I chose to do this because that's way more convenient than saying circumstances from a second ago to a million years ago led me to be changed in a way such that this is what I'm doing now. Right. I think maybe on a larger level, what you're saying is this is going to be really hard. This is going to be very difficult. And something that I'm almost like evangelical about by now is, yes, this is incredibly hard, but we have done it over and over and over again in history.
Right.
At one point, we thought lightning storms were caused by witches.
Right.
And then we managed to subtract that out of a notion of responsibility of the world. And society didn't fall apart. It became more humane.
Right.
And at some point, we figured out that mothers don't cause schizophrenia out of some sort of Freudian garbage going on in their heads. And no, it's a neurogenetic disorder. And the world didn't fall apart. It became vastly more. At some point, we figured out there are some people, no matter how much they try, they are going to be very, very overweight. Not because they lack self-discipline, but because they've got a weird gene variant of a receptor for one hormone. And as soon as that's recognized, we're able to subtract responsibility out of that concept, and the world runs better at that point. Right. We've done it over and over and over again, and all we have to do is push ourselves to keep doing that in the next realm where that comes up.
Yes, and then hope for the best.
Exactly.
Yes.